morning. That was phenomenal. Ed promised me he was going to be bad. I don't want to follow people that speak that well. I'm delighted to be here, and I want to get us on the same page. It should take about 30 seconds. Innovation is not a soundbite. It's not a gimmick. It's not a stroke of luck. Sustainable innovation in the church is imperative because of the gospel. It is a reflection of the nature of God, who from the very beginning of Scripture has been about creation and renewal. We never more reflect the nature of God in our churches when we insist on innovation that's not about being a gimmick, but is about the gospel. I spoke with John Bishop for the first time before I came up here, and to think about the amount of people in 3 years in his church that have been baptized and introduced to Jesus Christ, that's why we innovate. Not to be famous, not to be big, not for people to read our books, but because the gospel of Christ transforms people, and we forget that. And innovation reminds us that the gospel is always provocative. Always. It is never boring. It is about sustainable innovation in our churches that ignites a broad-based culture of innovation. So this morning, for the next 16 minutes and 45 seconds, I want to talk to you about how do leaders create an environment that in an ongoing way demands innovation and change and renewal. The first one is the word tensions. Leaders need to realize that leadership is much more about managing tensions than solving problems. Solving problems is important, but leaders live in the world of tensions, not balance, not in the middle, but somewhere in that pull of forces where you're constantly discerning how far do I move to what side in any given moment. If you're going to be a dangerous church, some of the tensions that you will have to struggle with are infrastructure and innovation. Can't have innovation without infrastructure, but when you're created to be innovative, sometimes you can be very dismissive of infrastructure. Here's where we have to cling once again to the gospel. God has wired some people up to be rock stars and some people wired up to be turtles. The turtles like to come to work every morning. They like to know, how are we going to make this happen? They want to know what the next step is. And some of us that are more innovative get very impatient with those people. The challenge in leadership and living in tensions is to activate spiritual gifts without elevating them. You cannot have an innovative culture if you elevate innovation to a higher level than the people that are gifted to do infrastructure. We have to work together and honor each other's contributions and believe deeply in them. Infrastructure stabilizes and supports an organization. And there are some people who are just wired up by God to do that reflexively. They are not second-class citizens. They are as important as those of us that like to be on the front edge creating and making forward progress. Innovators like to create and compel, and there needs to be a partnership. Change in an individual and in an organization is always twofold. It's incremental and it's exponential. It's little steps and it's big breakthroughs, and a culture of innovation embraces and insists on both kinds. It is the still small voice. It is the good news of the empty tomb. Small steps and big steps. Another tension that I think leaders need to struggle with in an innovative culture is between passion and humility. I've done a fair amount of work in my life with whatever current term we're using now, postmodern, emerging. Every time I say a word, they say, oh no, that's not the new word. It changed 4 seconds ago. So whatever the word is, that there are some of the most gifted and passionate men and women in our churches that are in that generation that we need to pay attention to. For those of us that are a little older than that generation, I know up on the screen it's hard to believe, but I'm not in that generation. That's a joke, but my son always says if it's a joke, it needs to be funny, Mom. For us, we have passion, we have calling and energy and a desire for impact, and that brings confidence, and those are all good things. But alone, without a corresponding humility, they're going to take us in the wrong direction. We don't choose between passion and humility. The answer for our passion and the sins that come with it is not to stop being passionate and to fully embrace only humility. It's much harder than that. It's to live in the tension of the two, to know when to be appropriately bold and confident, to know when to apologize and stand back so somebody else can have the spotlight. And we have to live in that uncomfortable tension of passion and humility. Leaders who are innovative get comfortable very quick living in tensions. The second thing I want to talk about when it comes to innovation is a word that you have heard so much. You're going to be tempted to dismiss me, but I'm going to ask you to hang with me for a minute. Innovation happens best in teams. I know you know that. Read everything Patrick Lencioni has ever written. Teams is the word that the world uses for the biblical concept of community. I have never met a leader in a corporate environment, an educational environment, or in a church or nonprofit environment that would disagree with that statement. I can count on both hands the times when I have been blown away by the magic of a team. You are absolutely underestimating what God wants to do in your church, and you're holding back your innovation if you are not predominantly using teams, not as a slogan, not as a buzzword, but as a leadership strategy. How do you engage and energize a group of people that have very different gifts to work together in the same direction? There is a magic of being on a team that is anointed by God to do his work. What does that mean for a leader? You've got to have spiritual gift radar. You need to be so well educated in what spiritual gifts are and what clues people give off. You should be able to, in about 4 or 5 sentences with somebody, determine what you think their spiritual gifts might be. It necessitates in a leader an ego that's in check. You don't know what your spiritual gift is? I'll tell you this. Somebody walks in the room with your spiritual gift and they're better at than you are. I can tell you right away you'll know what your spiritual gift is, because you'll feel the jealousy and the envy and the comparison start to creep up. An ego in check says, I will put people on the team who are better than me. One of the things I loved at Willow Creek is Hybels used to say all the time, John Ortberg's a better teacher than I am. I don't mean that unobjectively. I just remember watching him thinking, that's amazing. He would say, so-and-so's a better leader. This person's a better whatever. If the ceiling on the gospel in your church is you, we all might as well just go home right now. You invite people to the table that take your breath away. You're not threatened by them. You're not controlling them. You're not comparing them. And then you begin to orchestrate the interaction. You know their spiritual maturity. You know when to hold them back, when to let them go. And there's not a good, clean answer to that. And one other thing I would say when it comes to teams, we have to get better and better about inviting these next generations onto our teams. There's a fabulous scene in the movie Seabiscuit where some of you remember Red Pollard, the jockey, had been injured and was for a long time sitting out racing, and he had another jockey take his place. And when he regained his strength, he went back to the track at Santa Anita and got back on Seabiscuit. Now, while he was injured, he had told the other jockey what the secret of Seabiscuit was, because he wanted him to win. He said, you hold him back till about halfway through the race, and then you get him eye to eye with another horse, and you hold him there just long enough so he can catch the fire in the other horse's eye and feel that flame, and he'll move forward. And so Red Pollard on Seabiscuit is lining up at the starting gate, and the other jockey who rode Seabiscuit that last year is on another horse, and they began to do a little lightweight banter. And then the other jockey says to him, see you at the finish line. And then they line up, and the gate goes up, and the race starts, and it's very clear that Red Pollard's injuries are not completely healed, and that Seabiscuit is not having his best day, and he is in the back third of the pack. And then out of the blue, the other jockey pulls his horse back intentionally, giving up the race so that Seabiscuit can see the horse's eyes, and Seabiscuit takes off and wins. That is a picture of the church. You and I, in our 40s and 50s and 60s and 70s and 80s, intentionally pulling back and getting eye to eye with new generations in the church and putting them up on our shoulders and saying, tell me what you see. I won't go there, but you tell me what you see. And then taking them off our shoulders and looking them in the eye and say, see you at the finish line. And we build into these young leaders And we correct them when they make the foolish mistakes that we made 20 and 30 years ago. We encourage them to keep trying. We move them beyond, and we create teams. Last thing I want to talk about, what are the behavioral values that are necessary to nurture a culture of innovation? There are certain values that you need to embody as a leader because you set the tone. Like it or not, you do. You set the tone of the culture, and if you want innovation in your culture, there are some behavioral values, not just values that are on a piece of paper in a notebook, but values that shape your behavior. Lencioni talks about one of the key signs of core values is they inflict pain. They tell you what the limits of your diversity are. They inflict pain. They cause you to go a little slower than you might like. They cause you to make choices that cause pain. If they're not inflicting pain from time to time, they're not really values. First one is questions. Learn to be a great question asker. My experience is people will talk about themselves or their idea over and over again. And as you just heard from Ed, that can shape the direction unintentionally of the culture. Be a great question asker. One of my favorite questions as a leader is, I don't know, what do you think? Even when I think I do know, even when I'm sure I think I do know. To ask other people, tell me what you're thinking, to get multiple ideas out on the table. They've actually done recently brain scans that show an increase in brain activity when a question or an open-ended statement is given compared to when somebody just states a fact. It engages the brain. It releases the power of the gospel in people when we ask questions. And leaders can ask questions with a certain tone. You can be inquisitive or judgmental with the same question. It depends on your tone. And all of you that are parents know exactly what I'm talking about. You can show interest or impatience by the tone. Ask questions. Scott McKnight writes that people change in two situations, when they're on a quest or when they're in a crisis. And our job as innovative, dangerous churches is to figure out how do we attract people who are on a quest or in a crisis. And when you ask rhetorical questions in your sermons, you put seeds of provocation in people's brains, just like Jesus did. And they leave and they keep thinking about it, and the Holy Spirit continues the work that you started with your sermon on Sunday all throughout the week. In your team meetings, in your interactions with people, ask questions. Second behavioral value that we have to embrace to be innovative is risk. You know that. But here's the deal with risk. I'm here not to tell you, but just to remind you that risk comes with failure. They are kissing cousins. To be an innovative culture, your comfortability with failure has to go up. I'm working with a number of organizations that are actually starting to put on their performance evaluations for their employees the question, what risks did you take this last 6 months in which you did not succeed, and what did you learn from them? We talk about letting people succeed, but really the unspoken motto in most of our organizations is feel free to succeed. We have to really believe that risk and failure cannot happen without each other. Now, it's not about stupid risks. You're not reckless with them. But we should not penalize people for taking risks unless the results that are poor come from bad execution or a lack of effort. Those things need to be addressed, honestly. But if people are innovating, you should have as big a group of stories about your failures as you do about your successes. Great preachers do not come without a long list of bad sermons. They just don't. Great leaders do not come without a long list of times when they failed. The internet that has started to change the world was 30 years in the making. And so many steps along the way where people must have thought this isn't going to work. Here's the simple answer when you think about innovating. How do I know out of all the things that I'm innovating, which things are going to take off? You don't. And if you can't get comfortable in that tension, you will impede your ability to innovate. We criticize ideas too soon or too deeply. We make judgments on them when we need to fan the flame a bit. Last thing I want to say about risk. Biggest thing that stands in the way of risk is one word. It's the word fear. There is an inverse correlation between fear and curiosity. The best way I know to get fear out of your organization is to increase the amount of curiosity, which goes back to asking questions. Number one commandment in the Bible, do not be afraid. This is also a discipleship issue. We live our religion so much behind the skirt of fear. Third thing that you need as a behavioral value that you really insist on is collaboration. Now, that goes beyond just having a team. I've seen teams where a leader comes in with their vision and asks everybody to execute against that vision. That's not collaboration. That's not team. Collaboration is not abdication, but it is insisting that everybody shows up to the table with their ideas and opinions, and that you cross-pollinate across departments instead of building silos in your churches or in your organizations. Gary Hamel writes in his book, The Future of Management, that we have to allow for a divergence before we have a convergence. And that's the job of the leader, to orchestrate that process. You allow for lots of different kinds of thinking, and about the time you think you've got everything in, you start to begin to pull and push to get the team to work towards what's going to be our decision going forward. It's not compromise. I love Lencioni's definition of compromise. It's mutually agreed upon mediocrity. If you move to compromise, you are basically saying ahead of time, I'd much rather everybody not get their feelings hurt and come up with a mediocre decision rather than really driving hard to get the best decision going forward. Collaboration, more than dictating what people should do, will allow for innovation and creativity on a team. Last behavioral value is trust. We hear a lot about trust. Covey wrote this last year, a book called The Speed of Trust, one of the best books I've read on the topic of trust. Trust is about character, it's about competency, it's also about vulnerability. It's about the leader having the courage to say, I am not omnicompetent. Here's why I need a team, because I can't do this well, and I dropped the ball here. I need everybody on the team. It's part of what it means to build trust. And trust implies that we have patience with each other and that we know each other deeply enough to really have trust. Don't presume trust. As Christians, we can tend to do that. I only met you 2 days ago, but I trust you. Really? Trust is something that's built. It doesn't take 6 months to build trust, but you have to intentionally do things to build trust on a team in order to be an innovative culture. In finishing this morning, before we move on to the next speaker, I want to say a couple of things. The church has so many issues in front of us. Where I live in the Bay Area, our church attendance is 4 to 6%. Across the Bay in Berkeley, it's 1 to 3%. We have so quickly changed from a church culture to a non-church culture. There's not room not to be innovative. There are issues of justice and poverty and people who don't know Christ and inequitable access to education. And for the church to be on the forefront of solving those problems, it's going to take innovation. When it comes to making disciples well, one of the most innovative things I've seen is a tool coming out of a church in the Midwest, and the tool is called Monvee. Go look at it. It's Monvee. It's answering the question of when a one-size-fits-all approach to spirituality doesn't work anymore, what do we do for our people? How successful is it going to be? I don't know, but it's one of the most innovative things I've seen in a long time. Innovation basically comes from hope, and hope is where leaders live, because hope is deeply tied to the gospel. Thank you.